Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, December 7th, 2006. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. With this week, part 2 of our conversation with Maureen Ogle, author of Ambitious Brew, the story of American beer. In this half of the interview, we go from the end of Prohibition to the present, and you'll see why the golden age of American beer is today. Well, this is what our little town sounded like this past weekend. December 7th is not only Pearl Harbor Day, it also marks the anniversary of the Battle of Prairie Grove. On this day in 1862, Union and Confederate forces clashed, and at the end of the day, 2,700 were dead, wounded, or missing. Now, every even-numbered year, reenactors from across the country converge on our little town to restage the battle, and I thought I'd just share that with you. If you're a Civil War buff, you might think about visiting the Prairie Grove Battlefield State Park if you're in the area. It's a beautiful little park, and I believe they protected about 800 acres of the original battlefield. Now, let's move from our tourism corner to the mailbag. Greg from Brisbane, Australia writes, "Just thought I'd comment in response to your comments on the Saf Ale yeast. I've used this product for a couple of years now, and I've always found it exceptionally good. Sometimes when making smaller batches, 3 gallons, I've made a starter with this yeast and only pitched about half of it and kept the rest in the refrigerator for up to a month. Greg says when you take it out and add some wort, you can create a good starter within 2 days. I've also had great success with their Saf Lager and Saf Wheat yeast as well." Greg says, "I must admit that I am making all these comments not having ever used liquid yeast, but then I haven't had a bad batch of beer yet after 5 years as well." Well, thanks, Greg. It's always good to hear from Greg. He's the one who designed the quantity converter spreadsheet that's now on basicbrewingradio.com, and I hope you guys have found that to be useful. As I said in the last show, I've gotten good luck as well with the Saf Ale yeast product so far. And on those same lines, I tasted the six-pack porter on Monday when my son and I bottled it, and it tasted great. I can't wait for it to bottle condition a bit. That beer, that porter, as you can see if you watch the most recent episode of Basic Brewing Radio or video, was fermented using the Saf Ale 4 dry yeast. Tom from Indiana writes with a fun brew session. He says, "James, I know you have a lot of interest in brewing experiments and splitting batches. I thought I would pass this on." He says, "I'm an all-grain brewer with a system that handles 12-gallon batches well and have been experimenting with split batches post-boil, things like pitching different yeast strains and whatnot. This last batch, I tried something different. Tom says I mashed, sparged, and collected enough wort in the boil kettle for a 12-gallon batch. While I was heating this wort to a boil, I cleaned out my mash tun, a converted keg. I took off the copper manifold and fitted a collection tube and bazooka screen. I then drained half of the near-boiling wort into the mash tun and proceeded to boil both batches separately. I was making a pale ale, so one half was all Columbus hops, and the other was Magnum and Cascade. Tom says, I kept the IBUs and addition times the same. I staggered the boil slightly to allow enough time for chilling the first before the second was done. It added about 30 minutes to the brew day, but when all is said and done, I will have 2 different batches, or 2 different beers to enjoy." And Tom says, "Note, in order to be able to do this, you will need a heatable mash tun and 2 burners or heat sources." Well, thanks, Tom. That sounds like a fun and profitable brew day. 2 batches of beer, big batches of beer from 1 big mash. That's a great use of time. And both of those beers sound delicious. It'd be interesting to see the difference between the 2. Wayne from Plainfield, Illinois writes, "One area I have never heard discussed is using beer gas, which is 75% nitrogen and 25% CO2. I usually bottle my beer, but recently started carbonating some of my stout beers with this mixture using a stout faucet from Northern Brewer. Wayne says, it really makes a wonderful difference, especially with these dark beers. I just wondered what you or your listeners may have experienced with this technique. In my case, I am thrilled with the rich, creamy heads. Wayne says the nitrogen produces extremely small bubbles that this gas produces. Well, Wayne, my experience with beer gas has always come after I've drunk the beer. Thank you very much. I don't think we talked about using this process in this podcast. I believe Guinness and Boddington's Pub Ale and other commercial beers use a nitrogen widget in their cans, but we haven't talked about using nitrogen in the home brewing environment. It sounds like fun. If you used this technique that Wayne talks about, please drop me a line and let me know what you think. That's at james@basicbrewing.com, or you can just use the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from, and please be sure to check the spelling of your email address if you use that online form. I'm always disappointed when messages bounce back because of a bad address. Kirk from Temecula, California, sent a picture of himself wearing his Basic Brewing T-shirt at the Grand Canyon over the Thanksgiving holiday. Kirk says, please notice the gut, a direct result of my renewed interest in home brewing caused by your podcasts. So there you go. Basic Brewing, changing the figure of America and the world. You know, I always tell people that we have a growing audience. So there you go. Thanks, Kirk. You look great. Thanks for sending that in. And Kirk's with his child, I assume. Maybe his son. Y'all look great out there. It's a beautiful shot. I'll post a link to that shot in the description of this week's episode on basicbrewingradio.com. And I need to get off my keister and make a page for these shots to go on. I've gotten a few of them now, not a boatload or anything, but enough to build a little page. And while we're on the topic of basic brewing stuff, I mentioned a couple episodes ago that the Introduction to Extract Homebrewing DVDs are now available from our site without region encoding. So if you're not in North America and that was a concern for you, then you don't have to worry about that anymore. Just go to basicbrewing.com and check us out. Also, and this is fun news for everybody, we have a new thing coming to the online shop that I can't wait to start using myself. Steve Wilkes and I have collaborated on a Basic Brewing Brewer's Logbook, and Steve designed it, and it looks great. This is a wire-bound book that has a calendar section for 2007 in the front of it, and a section that consists of forms that you can use where you can log up to 50 brewing sessions. And if you're like us, your recipes are scattered all over the house on various sheets of paper, and we thought that this would be a great resource to have all your recipes, all your brew sessions in one bound book that you can take to your club meetings or whatever. Even if you use a computer to design your brews, this would be a great thing to have with you by the brew pot to keep up with the details of your brew. So I'm hoping to get these logbooks from the printer very soon, like in the next day or so. So check basicbrewing.com by this weekend to learn more about that. Okay, enough self-promotion. On to the second half of our interview with Maureen Ogle as we talk about beer in the USA from Prohibition to the present. After Prohibition, it really damaged the beer industry, the brewing industry, because not only were they knocked out of production for 13 years, they fell out of favor with Americans' taste buds as far as the drinkers were concerned.
Yeah, if anybody really took a hit from Prohibition, it was definitely beer makers as opposed to liquor makers. And again, I need to stress that Americans really did stop drinking. Alcohol consumption rates in this country did not reach their pre-Prohibition levels again until the 1970s. A lot of people just said alcohol is evil and I'm not going to drink. And that is one reason why there weren't a lot of brewers after repeal. I know that our image of the big rapacious brewers, and of course everybody's the big rapacious brewer that everybody thinks of is Anheuser-Busch, that somehow Anheuser-Busch came along after repeal and just squashed like a bug all these little local breweries. That isn't what happened. Anheuser-Busch was, yes, it was a relatively successful, but it was struggling along with everybody else. I was just astounded at how difficult it was for brewers to try to earn a living. It became an extraordinarily difficult way to earn a living, as it still is today, not least because one of the other long-term effects of Prohibition was that that what had been a relatively unregulated industry suddenly was burdened. A brewer, you can't imagine how many rules and regulations a brewer has to follow. It's just staggering. I don't know why anybody in his right mind or her right mind would go into brewing, because you're paying an exorbitant tax rate on what you make, and you're dealing with tons of regulations, and all of that stuff dates back to repeal.
And there's a stigma that we still have to live with as far as beer. People, a lot of people think automatically that if you drink beer, you guzzle beer, and of course that's what we try to fight against.
Yeah, and I think, that was, the brewers really didn't know what hit them. And as I said in the first part of the interview, the one thing that a pre-Prohibition brewer didn't really have to spend much money or time on was marketing. They didn't really have to think about how to sell the beer because they had these captive audiences, namely people who lived in cities who went to saloons every night because that's where the entertainment was. There wasn't television, there wasn't radio. People lived in very small houses or apartments, and you went into a saloon for an evening's entertainment. And so your market was right there in front of you. You didn't have to spend money to woo them. After Prohibition, a brewer could not own the retail outlet, and he had to figure out how to persuade the consumer, which was now mostly a woman in a grocery store, to buy that beer instead of this other beer. And so introducing beer marketing, and let's face it, I think beer marketing hit its all-time low with last year's Super Bowl game and the farting Clydesdales, but it's been that way, as brewers really tried right after Prohibition. They introduced low-calorie beers for women. They would host events in department stores to show women how they could cook with beer. They would run these very sophisticated ads in high-class magazines showing very sophisticated people wearing suits and ties and drinking a beer, and it just didn't work. People, if they were going to drink, they wanted a martini, and somehow beer was associated with these old saloon days when the average beer drinker was a guy who'd just gotten off work from a 12-hour shift in a steel mill. And brewers just never were able to overcome that. And once television entered the scene, and I'm jumping ahead a bit now, and brewers figured out that they could use sporting events, it just kind of went downhill from there, and they've never been able to dig themselves, mainstream brewers, not the craft brewers, they've never been able to dig themselves out of this marketing and advertising hole where essentially beer is treated as, yes, something on Saturday afternoon you're sitting on your sofa watching the Steelers or whoever and guzzling a can of beer.
So in the couple of decades following Prohibition, how was the taste of American beer affected?
It was affected in a profound way. And again, this is one of those things that people just don't, I think I made this up. And I was very, very careful to document this in the book using specific examples because I knew that people were going to have a hard time buying this. One of the things that beer makers faced after Prohibition was a culinary world that had changed. In the 19th century, if you sat down to a meal, chances are some poor woman had spent hours and hours since daybreak making the bread, stewing the chicken. Probably she killed the chicken and skinned it and the whole 9 yards, plucked the feathers out. One of the things that happened during Prohibition was that Americans discovered convenience foods. They discovered the joys of canned soups and boxed products where you just open a package and you add some water and you've got, stew or macaroni and cheese or whatever. And Americans loved convenience foods. They spoke of a new world, not like the old pre-Prohibition world where women wore dresses down to their ankles and slaved away literally at a hot stove all day long. Convenience foods spoke of a nation on the move, of, a different life for women who now wore skirts up to their knees. I really need to stress how much Americans loved modern convenience foods. But here's the thing about convenient foods that we don't even think about today because we're surrounded by them. The grain that is in, say, I won't use any brand names. The grain that is in a box of cereal bears virtually no resemblance whatsoever to the stalk of grain that once grew in the ground. Convenience foods are very, very heavily processed foods. Think about a box of macaroni and cheese, which as little kids we all just devoured, and I think little kids still love it today. That package of yellow stuff, it's got nothing to do with cheese from a cow, with milk from a cow. It's processed foods. The more you process a food, the more you package it, the more bland it becomes. And that is what Americans love. They love these heavily processed foods that were very sweet. There's a lot of sweeteners in things like ketchup and macaroni and cheese. I'm not knocking these foods. I'm just saying that this is what they're like. And Americans lost their palate for foods that had a well-defined, intense flavor. The classic example is vodka. Nobody had even heard of vodka before Prohibition. It became the most popular spirit in America in the 40s and 50s. Why? Because it doesn't have any flavor at all. It is completely bland, and that's what Americans wanted. So when beer makers, to get back now to the subject of beer makers faced another challenge after Prohibition. They had to figure out how to make a beer that Americans were actually willing to drink. And I use the example of Rupert Brewing in New York. Rupert had for years been one of the 4 or 5 biggest breweries in the United States. And they damn near went out of business after World War II because the brewmaster insisted on making a pre-Prohibition kind of beer, and people just wouldn't drink it because it was too heavy and too hoppy. And finally, the managers of the company said, look, cut the hops. You got to take the hops out of there. We don't care what you put in it, but you got to make this beer taste bland because nobody will drink it otherwise. And that is the only thing that saved Rupert Brewing, was making a very bland beer.
So it wasn't the big guys forcing these bland beers on us. It was the market seeking out these bland beers.
Yes, and I know that it's hard for people. I know that craft brewers and home brewers, most of them don't want to hear that because they really need for Anheuser-Busch to be the bad guy. And I'm not a defender of Anheuser-Busch, but yes, Anheuser-Busch, Schlitz, Yuengling, Leinenkugel, all of them faced the same problem, which was that they couldn't make yes, beers had been made with corn and rice in the late 19th century, but those were heavier still than the beers made in the 1950s. Americans, these guys hired market researchers, which was a new kind of thing where you actually, nowadays we take it for granted that any new product that comes on the market has been run through some sort of focus group. It's been run through a test group. But that was new in the 40s and 50s. And these brewers all ran these test groups, and what they found was the more bland the beer, the more corn and rice, the happier the consumer was. That's what people wanted. They did not want the flavor of the hops. They didn't even want that kind of malty, nutty graininess that you get from the grain itself. They wanted something very bland. So it's too simple to blame Schlitz and Anheuser-Busch for destroying American beer. That's not what was going on. These guys are just trying to stay in business.
And the beer gets even more bland with the emergence of the light versions.
Yeah, the whole light beer thing, boy, there's a story and a half. But yes, as time went on, brewers were trying anything, I might add. There was a brewer in Wisconsin who tried making a beer with a cola flavor and a beer with a Tom Collins flavor. This is how desperate they are. Diet beers became very popular in the 1950s because brewers were trying to appeal to women. They're trying to get anybody to drink the beer. They don't even care anymore who it is. Beer consumption, by the way, it remained completely flat from the end of World War II until 1961. Beer consumption in this country either dropped or stayed completely flat. It was a bad time to be making beer. So if you're a smart beer maker, You're going to do anything you can. You're going to sponsor football games on television. You're going to sponsor comedy hours. You're going to have radio programs. You're going to offer diet beer. You're going to offer flavored beer. You're going to do anything to try to persuade someone to drink your beer. And yeah, there were a lot of screwy beers. Yes.
So when did beer start getting good?
Well, now, when people say to me, what's the best beer, I always say it's the one that you enjoy most. So when did beer get to be good? Well, if you're a fan of Budweiser, you probably think it's been good all along, right? Just to be fair. But beer certainly began to change in the 1970s. And homebrewing came back into vogue. I was very surprised by this. Somehow I thought, because I'm in my 50s, so in my 70s, I was a young woman in the 1970s when everybody I knew was making homebrew and smoking dope. Okay, that's just what people were doing my age back then. So I kind of thought that's when homebrewing had come back into vogue, but I actually discovered that homebrewing came back into fashion in the early 1960s. There was actually a reaction from a sort of a backlash from a small segment of the population. There was a backlash against these very, very bland beers. And I was a little puzzled by the fact that it started in the 1960s. That didn't make any sense to me. I really thought it was the hippies in the 70s who started it, but I finally figured out what the deal was. And the deal was, and now I'm going to give everybody a short history lesson, the 1950s marked a time of full employment. The economy couldn't have gone more gangbusters than it was. Everybody who wanted a job had one. People like me who were born in the 50s were born into the most affluent generation in human history, not just American history. And for the first time, a lot of Americans had a chance to travel to Europe. Ordinary Americans, not just rich people, but ordinary people. Plus, a lot of ordinary people ended up in Europe. Like my dad, I was actually born in a military hospital in Germany because my parents ended up in Europe because of the war. My dad was stationed there after World War II. And a lot of people who traveled in Europe tasted different kinds of beers. They'd never tasted things like an English porter or a heavy Bavarian all-malt beer. They'd never tasted that stuff. And then Julia Child came along in the 1960s, and within just a couple of years in the early 1960s, she was in every television market in the United States. I can't begin to convey to you what a huge impact Julia Child had on Americans' conception of what food should taste like. And here's a third group of people. A lot of people were sent to Islamic countries in the 50s and 60s to work either for the federal government, the CIA or whoever, or for big multinational corporations, and they discovered they couldn't drink at all. And the easiest thing to make at home is beer. You know, it's a lot easier to make beer than it is to make gin if you're going to make alcohol at home. So all of a sudden, this confluence of events in the 1960s suddenly brought homebrewing to a place it had not really ever been before.
And was it, I talked to the father of a friend of mine who said he used to get the Blue Ribbon malt extract kits, and brew and then ferment in an open crock with a couple of cookie sheets over the top of it, which which would horrify most of the homebrewers today. But it worked for him.
Yes.
So. But there was more quality homebrewing going on than just those kits.
There were. Here's one way that I sort of measured what had happened. There's a guy named Michael Lewis who recently retired from the University of California at Davis. For years and years, he essentially ran the brewing school at UC Davis, which has turned out some of the most important beer makers of the last 25 or 30 years. It's still the most important brewing program in the U.S. Michael Lewis went to work at UC Davis. He's actually English. He trained in England and then was hired for this job in California at Davis. And he came to the States in, I think, 1962, and he said within a year he was just so sick of answering questions. People would call him up and say, so my home brew's gone sour. What should I do? Or, I'm having a problem with the yeast. What should I do? He got so sick of it, of answering these questions, that he started to offer essentially adult education classes in home brewing. And I should add, for your listeners who don't know, home brewing was illegal. After Prohibition, because of a weird fluke in the way the repeal law was written, home brewing was actually still illegal. You could make wine at home, but you couldn't make beer. So Michael Lewis would say, look, you're all breaking the law, just don't try to sell the beer and let's not talk about this too publicly. But it was clear to him that there were a lot of people out there who wanted to make beer. Here's more evidence. There was a Canadian guy who opened a chain of stores called Wine Art. Wineart. Fred Eckert, who is a homebrewing guru, actually worked at one of these in Portland, Oregon back in the 60s. And there was so much, these stores were for people who wanted to make wine, but this guy who owned the chain quickly figured out that he needed to throw in, some supplies for the beer makers, because that's mostly who was coming by the stores. And these homebrewing shops were all over the country. I mean, they were in Iowa. There was actually one in Iowa, if you can imagine such a thing. There was this resurgence of home brewing in the 1960s. It was quite something, and it was illegal.
But in 1978, Jimmy Carter signed the law that legalized it.
There was a lot of pressure from homebrewers in the 70s to get this legalized. In 1973, the Treasury Department, which is the government body that is responsible for all alcohol in this country. I know that seems weird, but that's ultimately who has responsibility for alcohol in the United States. The Treasury Department actually issued a formal warning to homebrewers telling them to cease and desist. So clearly there were a lot of homebrewers by then. And in 1978, a California congressman whose name completely escapes me, and some other people lobbied Congress to have President Carter legalize home brewing. And so it has been legal since 1978, yes.
And where does Charlie Papazian come in?
Charlie Papazian was one of those people who in the late 60s and early 70s discovered home brewing. He was a college kid, and he and a friend went over to another friend's house one day. This was an older man who I'm guessing had grown up during the Depression and the tail end of Prohibition. And he was a home brewer, and Charlie told me, he was used to drinking 69-cent six-packs of, Blatz or whatever, and he'd never tasted anything like this before, and he was immediately hooked and just developed a complete passion for homemade beer. And he moved to Boulder and was, again, it's still illegal in the early 70s. He's teaching classes at a community free school, and Charlie is a big believer in community. That really matters to him a lot. He likes to have people get together and have a good time. He likes to have people feel that they belong to something. And he discovered that home brewing was a way to bring people together. He developed a reputation in the Boulder area for his home brew and for these beer stocks that he and another friend of his, Charlie Matson, would hold once a year. They'd go up into this meadows in the foothills, and about 500 people would show up and play volleyball and sing and dance and drink homebrew over the weekend. And he was trying to figure out how he could turn his passion for beer into a career. He was actually a grade school teacher. I think he taught at a Montessori school. And he loved beer. He wanted to, who can blame him for wanting to make a career out of it? And frankly, when he told me the story of the creation of the American Homebrewers Association, I thought, man, this guy, he's either got more chutzpah than anybody I've ever met in my life, or he's got a screw loose, because it was such a goofy idea. It was just, he and Charlie Matson sat down in a friend's living room with a pot of glue and pasted together this newsletter and then took it and mimeographed it somewhere and they just came up with a mailing list of people who'd been to these beer parties, people who'd taken classes. Every brewery in the country, Anheuser-Busch actually has the full run of what is today called Zymergy. The first issue appeared in December 1978. And, Charlie, the first issue is hilarious because he and his buddy, Charlie Matson, are acting as if they are representing this enormous group of millions of homebrewers. Nobody knows who they are. The American Home Brewers Association consists of the two of them. It's just hilarious to read, and yet it worked. When I look back on that I'm just floored that from this goofy idea that Charlie's trying to figure out how to bring people together and how to make a career in beer. From that came first the American Home Brewers Association, and then, of course, the first Craft Brewing Association, because almost by accident he ended up kind of functioning as the gathering place, not just for home brewers, but for these equally screwball people who thought they were going to build small microbreweries.
And it's the microbrewers who were formerly home brewers who kind of cobbled together these little breweries, and some of them made it, some of them didn't, but the taste for American beer started to change.
Yes, the very first generation of microbrewers, Jack McAuliffe is the very first microbrewer. He built his brewery with his own two hands on the outskirts of Sonoma, California. It was called New Albion, and I'm guessing most of your listeners have heard of it. He's never really gotten the credit he deserves, and I hope the book finally puts him in his place in history, because he deserves credit for what he did. He inspired a lot of other homebrewers, people like Ken Grossman, who was another homebrewing fanatic who was living in Chico, California, and who really wanted to translate, like Charlie Papazian, he wanted to try to figure out how to make a career out of beer. How could he take this passion for homebrew and turn it into something that would allow him to make a living? And, I mean, when you think about it, it's just so screwy that he and Jack, they built these breweries with their own two hands. Ken was driving around Northern California and Southern Oregon in his 57 Chevy, rummaging through junkyards, literally, and abandoned dairies, looking for pipes and vats and anything he can find, and then he went back to Chico and built this place. I mean, that's just so weird that no matter how many times I tell that story, I just think, man, that's amazing that he did that. But again, he came out of this home brewing tradition. Home brewing was absolutely central to the creation of the microbrewing industry. So everybody who's a home brewer needs to know that their history as a home brewer is part of this very, very profound moment in the history of American brewing.
I can hear chests swelling around the world.
Well, they should. You know, it's and Charlie Papazian absolutely deserves credit. He's been criticized by a lot of people for a lot of things, but he had a vision. I mean, he saw that these home brewers could come together in a community. But then he saw that if he provided a place for these microbrewers to come together, because they didn't know each other. Ken Grossman didn't know the microbrewers in Wisconsin or in Michigan or in upstate. They didn't know each other. And Charlie provided a way for them to communicate with each other. And I think eventually craft brewing would have become a craft brewing industry. But it's clear to me as a historian that Charlie Papazian significantly accelerated the process. And I say Charlie because he's the most visible face of that. But there were a hardcore group of volunteers. The only person who was actually getting paid at the time was Daniel Bradford, who is today publisher of All About Beer magazine. But he was actually Charlie's first paid employee. Daniel went to work for him in, I think, the spring of 1982, right after the first Great American Beer Festival, which, you know, there's another example of chutzpah. The Great American Beer Festival, it lasted, I think, 4 hours, and I think there were 20 beer makers there. And, but Charlie said, no, we're going to have a Great American Beer Festival, and as I'm sure many of your listeners know, it celebrated its 25th anniversary in September, which is extraordinary, that from these tiny, almost accidental beginnings in home brewing, so much has come out of that. It's amazing. I don't know where I was going with all that. Well, anyway, Charlie's Charlie's the public face, but there are other people who are absolutely crucial, among them Daniel Bradford.
Well, it's all about the marketing. It's if you say you're something, and you get enough people believing you, then you become that something.
Well, it absolutely worked for Charlie Papazian. I'm telling you, he was just full steam ahead. He could see this in his mind, and he said, okay, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make this happen. I mean, when he had the first microbrewers conference, he had the first Great American Beer Festival, which again, it's hilarious that that's the name he gave it. Like he was comparing it to the one in Britain, which of course was a much bigger deal. And who'd ever heard of Charlie Papazian anyway? And the next day he had a 90-minute session in which a couple of these microbrewers showed up and told a standing room only audience of homebrewers how to make the transition from home brewing to microbrewing. I mean, it's amazing because the brewing industry today is profoundly different than it was in 1978, just profoundly. Today, the United States has the most exciting, dynamic brewing industry in the entire world. And again, had it not been for a lot of really devoted hippies and professors and corporate workers and just people like Patrick Baker who were interested in getting people together. He was on the East Coast and he owned a small brewing supply shop and he brought home brewers together. If it hadn't been for those people, I don't know that we would have the brewing industry that we have today. It's an enormously exciting time to be a beer maker and a beer drinker.
And there is sort of a parallel and a difference between the first Germans who cobbled together these breweries back in the 1800s and, the homebrewers and hippies that cobbled together these and are still cobbling together these small breweries today. But there is also a difference in that I think that there's more of a spirit of collaboration instead of competition at this point.
Yes, you are dead on the money on both points. In fact, again, that really surprised me. I realized about halfway through the book that I was really writing this book about the pursuit of the American dream. And so I started with these German immigrants, sort of almost inadvertently discovered that's what they were doing. But then I got to the end of the book, and people like Jack McAuliffe and Ken Grossman and Jim Cook, who absolutely deserves credit for his contribution to craft brewing. And I realized that they were also pursuing the American dream, only it's almost like they were the direct descendants of these German immigrants in their passion and their ambition, but it's like they were having a counter-revolutionary American dream, if that makes any sense. And yes, the spirit, I really didn't have any first-hand experience with this until the Great American Beer Festival in Denver, when I finally got to meet people who I only knew by phone or had only read about. And I was humbled and awed by the extraordinary spirit of cooperation and collegiality, not just among the craft brewers. I mean, these guys like each other. They like to talk to each other about what they're doing in the brew house, but also between and among the commercial brewers and the home brewers themselves, who are really treated as very much a part of the brewing industry. And again, Charlie deserves credit for that. When the when the craft brewing trade group, his group, and the small brewers group merged in early January 2005, Charlie insisted that home brewers be given a place at the table. Home brewers sit on the board of directors now of the craft brewing trade group. And he insisted that they are so integral to the industry. They're so important in bringing new ideas to the table and in supporting craft brewing that he wanted them there. For example, I'm sure that most of your listeners know about the competition. One of the things that happened at the brunch that Jim Cook held, where you and I actually first met, was that Jim introduced the winners of his home brewing contest.
Mm-hmm.
He wants input from home brewers because there's an enormous amount of talent among home brewers who aren't planning to go commercial, but who are doing it just for the love of it. Home brewing is still absolutely central to brewing today.
And every professional brewer that we've talked to has been really open and willing to share, techniques and advice and all that. And as an indication of the cooperation that's going on out there, we did an interview with Adam Avery of Avery Brewing Company, and he said that he was talking to Vinny Chilurzo of Russian River because they both had a beer of the same name. And they got on the phone, they said, is this going to be a problem? And they said, no, it's not going to be a problem. And in fact, last month they were to brew a beer called Collaboration, Not Litigation, that was a blending of their two recipes. So
yeah, that's just you just don't meet people like that very often. I'm really just overwhelmed by the people in brewing today. The home brewers I met in Denver who were just so excited to be there, and they can actually just walk up to a guy like Vinny Cilurzo, who's just a fabulous human being, just a delightful human being, and talk to him, and he doesn't give them the brush off. Jim Cook wants to know what home brewers are doing. He has his long shot contest where you can enter your homebrew recipe and then he's going to brew it. The cooperation and just the sense of community among commercial and home brewers is, I don't know that there's another industry like it at all, frankly.
And you've got rock stars in this new group of brewers, like Sam from Dogfish Head, who he was when he would step out of the booth at the Great American Beer Festival, he was either surrounded by women or by beer guys who wanted him to autograph their books. So, and everybody wants a picture with Sam.
He's like Cher. You don't even need to say his last name. Everybody knows who Sam is, right? And Vinny is the same way. Vinny's not quite as dynamic. Sam is just this. He just walks into a room and takes over. And Vinny is a much more unassuming guy. And I don't mean that as a criticism of either one of them, but Vinny was just also mobbed by people. Well, Charlie Papazian. When I was in Denver, the reason I was there was that I was at the Brewers Association booth signing copies of the book, which had literally just come off the press. And Charlie and I were doing book signings at the same time. And as soon as Charlie showed up, instantly, like magic, this long line of people would form in front of him. He's just, all they wanted was his autograph. They wanted to have their picture taken with him. It was amazing to me what he's a celebrity. Yeah, Sam, Vinny, yeah, it's quite something.
Well,
yeah.
I, like many people, were brought into the hobby by getting a copy of Papazian's book. So, he is responsible for, I would say, a vast majority of people getting into homebrewing in the country.
Yes,
and
he definitely, especially in the late 70s and then really in the 1980s, he gave home brewing a public face. I don't think people realize now, because most home brewers maybe weren't in it then, Charlie spent most of his time on the road. He would go around the country to wherever there was a home brewing club or a microbrewery, and they would host these events where he would just essentially teach a sort of a workshop, a really quickie workshop on how fun home brewing could be, and converting thousands of people as he went. And then, of course, as microbrewing took off, even more people got interested in home brewing. And, I mean, look at you're doing a radio gig based on home brewing. That's amazing to me.
Who would have thunk it?
It's just, I mean, I'm an historian, so I'm supposed to be objective about all this, but I'm amazed at how much has happened and how profoundly things have changed in the last 30 years. It's just amazing to me. Yeah.
Well, look into your crystal ball. I mean, at this point, these brewers who are they're expanding now, but it's kind of being pushed the other direction instead of expansion at all costs. It's kind of like they're gaining market share, and people are it's more demand that's pushing their expansion, which is kind of the opposite of the original expansion of beer. Mm-hmm. And right now, the atmosphere is cooperative. But it's probably because there is sort of an enemy that they can combine and face,
yes.
The big brewers.
Yes.
So do you get a feel of where we go next?
Well, I'll tell you, if you're a craft beer fan or if you're in craft brewing, you have a sort of skewed view of the world, because right now the only segment of the beer industry that's actually growing is craft brewing, but it's growing only in very tiny bits and pieces. Beer consumption itself, this is a sad fact, but it's true. Overall, per capita beer consumption in this country has been flat or has declined steadily since 1990. Now, that puts the fear of God into Anheuser-Busch. People wonder why Anheuser-Busch is being so aggressive. I'll tell you why they're being aggressive. because they need to keep the stock of the company healthy. They don't want people to say, oh, gee, I think Microsoft is a better investment than Anheuser-Busch. So Anheuser-Busch right now is essentially not exactly on the warpath, but they're on the march. They are prepared to do anything necessary to keep Anheuser-Busch stock rising in price rather than falling. For example, as many of your listeners may know, a few months ago, Anheuser-Busch bought the Labatt brand. They didn't buy the brewery. I'm sorry, not Labatt, the Rolling Rock brand. They just bought the brand and the label. They didn't buy the brewery. And now, why would they want that? Because Rolling Rock is regarded as sort of a nostalgia beer, just like Pabst. Pabst has got to be the greatest marketing scam in the past century, if anybody wants my opinion. And so Anheuser-Busch bought Rolling Rock because it's going after this small group of beer drinkers who were kind of into kitschy, nostalgic beers like Pabst. Pabst appeals now to this sort of, I don't know, alternate whatever. Anyway, I'm getting off the subject here. So on the one hand, Miller is not in great shape, and Anheuser-Busch is really being as aggressive as it has ever been in its history. And that means that everybody is in a little bit of danger because Anheuser-Busch, not because they're going to, because Anheuser-Busch is going after any share of the market it can lay its hands on. It will do anything. It's coming out with an organic beer. It's coming out with very delicious, full-flavored, all-malt beers that I got to taste some of them in Denver. They're magnificent beers. Make no mistake, the people at Anheuser-Busch know how to make beer. You may not like the beer they make, but they are really good beer makers. So that's what's happening at the top. At the bottom, every day you've got someone who says, you know what, I love beer and I'm going to go into the business. And somebody opens a new microbrewery and is making really smart, innovative, enormously delicious beers like Vinny and Sam, who are just extraordinarily creative beer makers. And the other thing that's happening is that guys like Ken Grossman, Ken is my age. He's actually a year younger than me. He's in his early 50s. It's not clear to me how much longer he's going to want to keep doing what it's doing, and it's not clear to me that his kids want to come in. I'm not trying to start a rumor that the company's for sale, but at some point, he, for example, and Jim Cook may say, well, you know what? I think I need to start thinking about retirement because I've been working my butt off. Now, it's not clear to me what's going to happen to their companies. I do know that that Fritz Maytag would like to sell Anchor, but he's going to be very careful about who he sells it to. And Anheuser-Busch will buy anything that's moving. So I think that we're in for some interesting times between retirements and Anheuser-Busch's just really ferocious aggressiveness, and the fact that all these new people keep coming into the business, even though, as you know, any beer maker will tell you, there ain't no money in it. It's a real hard way to make a living. I don't think good beer is going to go away anytime soon, but I think we're in for interesting times.
Well, it should be interesting to see it evolve.
Yes, yeah.
And,
there's just never been a better time to be a beer drinker, whether you're a home brewer. I mean, right now, home brewers today have no idea what it was like to be a home brewer 30 years ago, even 25 years ago. You couldn't get the kind of really great stuff, the supplies that you have now, and the technical support. All you had were these, dry, desiccated cakes of yeast and malt, and, you can pretty much do anything now. Apparently, the guy who won Home Brewer of the Year this year, he actually lives about a mile from me, and I've never been to his house, but I'm told that his basement, is probably about the size of his brewery he's set up is about the size of Ken Grossman's original brew house. The things you can do today are amazing. There's never been a better time to drink or make beer. That's for sure.
Yeah, I'm amazed at what we can do as home brewers as well, and the ingredients that are available to us, and the techniques where you can do it as simple as you want to. If you want to do a canned extract beer, you can do that, and if you want to do an all-grain beer with a decoction mash and lager it at home, and even use adjuncts tastefully, you can do that.
Yeah, and just as recently as 25 years ago, you couldn't do things like that. There just weren't there wasn't any equipment. The supplies were really of such an inferior grade. So, yeah, how long have you been home brewing?
About 10 years, a little longer than 10 years.
Yeah, you came into it at a time when there was a lot of really great stuff. You know, find somebody like Fred Eckert. Well, I'm sure you've talked to Fred. You know, he's got some stories about what it was like in the old days.
He's on the list, but I haven't gotten to him yet.
You haven't interviewed him? Oh,
No.
Man, listen, he's my hero. He's one of the most amazing human beings I've ever met in my life. You've got to interview the guy. He's if you can get him. I don't know any 80-year-old who's busier than he is. He's going a million miles an hour. He's amazing. He's fascinating. He's been home brewing for decades and decades.
Well, we went to Charlie Papazian's house, so you know,
that's nice.
It's going to be hard to top that.
Well, try. Charlie, I'll tell you what amazed me about Charlie, who I had not actually met in person until Denver. Although, you know, I interviewed him at length for the book, and we've exchanged a zillion emails because I had a million questions. He has so much patience. I found the Great American Beer Festival to be one of the most exhausting experiences of my life. The noise level is just unbelievable. And Charlie never flags. You know, he's just constantly gracious. He has the stamina of a 10-year-old. I'm in awe of that guy, man.
Well, it's because all the time he's chanting in his head, relax, don't worry, have a homebrew.
He probably is. It's probably become sort of like his version of Om. Yeah, I mean, he and his wife both just never. You know, Charlie never frowns. He's either really heavily drugged up or something. You know, I'm kidding, of course.
Well, no, he's living. He's high on life. He's living his dream.
He is. There is a man who had a vision for what he wanted with his life, and you know, he got really emotional when he was because this was the 25th anniversary of the Great American Beer Festival, and I was fortunate enough to participate in the press conference that opened it and give people some historical background about, you know, why they should care that it is, you know, what this really means, that it symbolizes 25 years of craft brewing. And you know, it does mean a lot to Charlie. He was quite emotional when he was honored during the award ceremony, and he absolutely deserves credit for what he's done. He's come in for a lot of static, and some of the criticism he probably, over the years, he probably has brought on himself. But as he pointed out, he didn't really ever know what the hell he was doing. You know, he was just kind of making it up as he went along because nobody knew how to do this, right? Nobody knew how to start a craft brewing industry. How do you turn a bunch of guys scattered around the country, and they were mostly guys, how do you turn that into an industry? So, Lord love him, he's a jewel.
Well, Maureen, I appreciate all your time, and I appreciate the book. You did a really good job.
Thank you. As I said, I have come in for a fair amount of heat. I've been called a shill for the big brewers, and I've been called a neoconservative. I have no idea how someone got neoconservatism out of that book. But, you know, again, I'm just an historian. I was just trying to tell. I'm not a beer person, you know, so I had a great time writing about the home brewers. The funniest, hands down, the funniest paragraph in the book involves home brewing. So I hope people read far enough to get to, and I had to leave a lot of stuff out of the whole home brewing thing. I had to cut pages and pages, sadly. But yeah, home brewers, pat yourselves on the back and then hoist a beer in your own honor.
Well, thanks, Maureen.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Well, thanks again to Maureen Ogle. Her book is Ambitious Brew, The Story of American Beer. We appreciate Maureen taking so much time with us. It was fun to talk to her. Next week, I'm planning to talk to Ed Westemeyer, Communication Director of the Beer Judge Certification Program, the BJCP. We'll get some background and information on this very influential and important organization. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And while you're on our site, you can check out our online shop where you can find great pricing on our DVDs and a combo deal on the DVDs to save you even more in our newly reformatted Basic Brewing Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, which is now no region encoding and adds a little section on how to make a starter. We walk you through the extract brewing process step by step from boiling to bottling. And in Basic Brewing, stepping into all grain, we take you through the all grain process from milling your grain to collecting your wort. And we have nonlinear navigation in there so you can kind of design your experience to go through that. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online. Also, be sure to look for those new Brewers logbooks this weekend. Thanks to everybody who's been clicking on our Amazon.com link and doing their holiday shopping. Again, it's fun to see what you're buying, even though I can't see who's buying what. That's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by the able, capable, and talented Kelly Dodson, who also designed our logo. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.